are you doing with those flowers? I asked the next morning as our train rolled south across the wide, flat prairie toward Mississippi. Oh, that's far from where they are. Right now, I would show you a map, and I would let you know that Illinois and Chicago are quite a ways away from Mississippi. It's basically going from the northern part of that country to the southern part of the country. I was watching Aunt Kitty stitch brown and blue peasant feathers to an otherwise respectable black velvet bonnet. I recognized those feathers to be the very ones that came off the bonnet she'd found on our landlady's stoop a few months ago. I'd have to tell Gemma more about Aunt Kitty and her frugality. Frugality means she's a penny pincher, trying to save money at all times. I'm creating part of my costume, she said in a low voice. There were only a few other riders in our rail car, but I knew how important it was to remain undercover. I peered around at our fellow passengers, studying their faces one at a time. Was there an eavesdropper right here among us? A criminal? Could we talk more about the case we're on? I whispered, scooching closer on the wooden bench across from her. Mr. Pinkerton talked so fast yesterday evening. I feel better knowing a few more of the particulars. Aunt Kitty nodded in agreement, though her eyes stayed fixed on her sewing. She took her time explaining the heart of the matter as she slipped her everyday bonnet from her head and substituted the flouncy, feathery one in its place. The long pheasant feathers made it appear that a large bird had nested and died up there. Here are the facts, I understand them, she began quietly. A bank teller was murdered in cold blood, and money was stolen. Even more money, in fact, than the $50,000 in the Maroney case. The sum stolen in this bank murder was $130,000. So a bank teller is somebody that works at the bank. So when you go to the bank and there's a person that's normally there to hand you the money or to do the transaction with, that's called a bank teller. I stared out the window at the scenery rushing past, trying to imagine all those zeros. Aunt Kitty said the bank's president asked Mr. Pinkerton for help solving the crime and getting that money back. And the lead suspect was a man of high society, the dead bank teller's best pal. So if it's a man of high society, that kind of means it's like a fancy person in the community, maybe somebody rich, maybe somebody who has a lot of power in the town. I couldn't help but gasp. A best friend like Gemma? And as Mr. Pinkerton explained, our job is to befriend the suspect and other townsfolk. Until we've solved this case, you and I shall go by the alias Potter. I will be known as Mrs. R.C. Potter, and you, Nell, will portray my niece, Penelope Potter. We will be staying at a local hotel in Atkinson under the pretense of my being of ill health and in need of rest and recuperation in beautiful northern Mississippi. You will be accompanying me to help with my convalescence. Help her get better. I stared at her blankly for a moment or two, turning that word around in my head. Convalescence means to get better? Aunt Kitty said convalesce. Back up. Convalesce means to get better, Aunt Kitty said testily. And we will still drill our vocabulary along with sums nightly during our southern sojourn. Trip. I smiled and bounced heartily on the rail car bench, fluffing up my washed-out red checkered dress. I didn't care how many vocabulary words she was going to make me memorize. This sure beat the pants off marketing for day-old meats. And Mr. Pinkerton had mentioned something about my playing a ghost this time, which sounded much easier than playing with an unruly child. Remember the unruly child from before? Before long, the door opened on the rail car, and Detective Webster appeared. Since I'd been helping out stitch in the detectives' costumes, I'd become friendly with a few of the agents, and Mr. Webster was the merriest. Like a playful uncle, he was always ready to tease. Good afternoon, ladies, he said with a formal bow and tip of his hat, and taking a seat next to Aunt Kitty, he gave my arm an affectionate punch. I couldn't resist the urge to punch him right back, which made him utter a howl that quickly transformed into a belly laugh. Nell Warren, he said in a low voice so he wasn't overheard. Your aunt tells me all sorts of things about you, but she's failed to mention your right hook. You've got quite an arm for a girl. She's got quite an arm, period, Aunt Kitty corrected with a smile. She's as strong as any boy, Mr. Webster, and you'd be wise to remember that. Oh, I know never to underestimate the ladies, Mrs. Warren, he declared. Women are like coffee, strong and bracing, but if you're not careful, they'll make you jumpy and irritable. Side note, that was a simile. Women are like coffee. Comparison between two things using the words like or as. Consider me warned. And he laughed hard at his own joke, which sent Aunt Kitty laughing too. She gathered her things to join him for a meeting in the next car with Mr. Pinkerton. But before she left, Aunt Kitty leaned in close and whispered, her breath smelling faintly of licorice. We'll be making a rest stop soon, and I want you to use that time to change into your disguise for Mr. Bangs. You'll find it in my green bag, and I believe there are enough pheasant feathers to make a fashionable new bonnet for you, too. We are Potters now, Penelope. When you arrived in Atkinson, we should be in full costume. And with a quick nod, she was gone. I decided I would show Aunt Kitty my Godey's Lady Book magazine when she returned so she could see the latest fashions in bonnets. I did not want to parade around Mississippi wearing one of her deceased winged friends on my head, meaning the dead bird that's on their head. Heaving her overstuffed bag up onto the bench across from me, I undid the clasp. Reaching in past a pile of apples and a wrapped loaf of Mrs. Wigginbottom's Indian cornbread, I felt around until I touched the soft material of what must have been a gown of some sort. With 2 hands, I unfolded it, only to behold the most beautiful, most fashionable, most exquisite dress I had ever laid eyes on. Frills of flowery orange silk tumbled to the floor, the glossy fabric whispering about me. My cup of happiness didn't just runneth over right then. It was spilling all over that rail car, making a complete mess of things. I got something in my eye, I said to the empty seat across from me, quickly turning my face to the window. I wiped my nose on the sleeve of my sad checkered dress and took a deep breath, trying mightily to get a hold of myself. But I couldn't. Guys, what's going on right here? If you recall, the title of the chapter included when I get a bit choked up. I think that this might be that moment. And she's trying to pretend by saying, I got something in my eye. I think she might be crying. Nobody had ever given me such a thing of beauty in my whole life. Just the thought of getting to wear something so lovely sent me bawling like a bald-headed baby. Another good simile. Who needs a fashion book like Godey's when she had a dress like this one to wear? We hadn't been in town for even half a day before we were introduced to the high society of Atkinson's, Mississippi. Aunt Kitty, or I should say Mrs. Potter, was a sight in her sizable bonnet with the bird roosting atop. But her red and gold plaid gown with full petticoats, which I'd recognize she'd sewn from her fortune-teller costume, was the envy of all. Mrs. Potter, it's a pleasure to meet you, and Miss Penelope, the Atkinson ladies were saying with formal bows and curtsies. There was so much bobbing and grinning and nodding up and down, they looked like a covey of quails. Their eyes devoured Aunt Kitty's dress, taking in all the flounces, as well as my gorgeous one with its bell sleeves and tiered skirt. But when their gazes landed on one of my scuffed brown boots peeking out from beneath the hem, the fussing over us stopped, and Aunt Kitty felt the need to fill the awkward silence. Remember, she's wearing those old boots, so it doesn't quite go with her dress. My niece Penelope has an affliction of the foot, she said, shooting me a look that could have set fire to kindling wood. Her boots ensure that her bones grow straight. So Aunt Kitty totally just lied, trying to come up with an excuse on why Nell's boots are so bad. I smiled and nodded, feeling more magnificent than one of their Mississippi magnolia blossoms. And frankly, my daddy's boots had never looked better, draped by the beautiful floral skirt as they were. You must dine with us tonight, insisted one of the society ladies. Her name was Mrs. Drysdale, and she had gentle eyes that drooped down just a hint at each corner, giving her a sweet, doe-like appearance. Both you and Miss Penelope. Aunt Kitty was eager to take her up on this offer and get some clues to the murder mystery. So we called at Mrs. Drysdale's home at 6 o'clock sharp. The other society belles were already there, and they made quite a fuss over us again as we entered the grand foyer. That's the fancy house. So they're Southern belles, so they're fancy people from the South. So they're living this fancy life, okay? Please, won't you follow me into the dining room, Mrs. Drysdale was saying with another few curtsies. Aunt Kitty and I did our fair share of gracious dipping and bowing and bobbing, then we tromped off towards the table. Only I guess I might have been the only tromper, because Aunt Kitty gave me another severe look, meaning, shape up now, make it look fancier. When we stepped into the dining room, the other guests drifted around the long table and began taking their seats. But I noticed a well-dressed man in the far corner of the room standing as still and stiff as a candlestick. Gosh, lots of similes today. Standing as still and stiff as a candlestick. He was gazing out the window, seeming unaware that the room behind him had filled up. Mrs. Potter, I'd like to introduce you to my husband, Mr. Drysdale. He's a bit distracted lately as his dear friend was recently taken from this world in a terrible, violent manner. Dun, dun, dun. Could this be the friend that killed him? Mr. Drysdale turned from the window at the sound of his name and seemed to snap back into the present moment. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Potter, he said, bowing, his pale face towards my aunt and forcing a smile. His expression looked nervous, and there were dark circles under his eyes. And your niece, Penelope Potter, I presume? Mrs. Drysdale told me of your arrival. When he turned to me, a chill raced so quickly across my back and shoulders, I actually looked beside me to see if a mouse had scurried out the bottom of my petticoats. Very interesting. I'm going to read that part again. When he turned to me, a chill raced so quickly across my back and shoulders, I actually looked beside me to see if a mouse had scurried out the bottom of my petticoats. Think about the reaction that she just got from taking a look at Mr. Drysdale. Let's all take our seats, shall we? Directed Mr. Drysdale with a vague wave of his arms. He turned to a white-haired lady on his right and launched immediately into a dull conversation about the weather, and soon the whole table was buzzing with the usual pleasantries. Is that our suspect? I whispered to Aunt Kitty as I fumbled with my napkin. According to Mr. Pinkerton, she said softly, a smile painted on her lips as she realigned her fork and knife. Mr. Drysdale is the one, yes. He looks weak as a sickly lamb, I observed, folding and refolding my napkin and pretending to be absorbed in my place-setting. How do you suppose he committed the murder? Aunt Kitty turned to her left and greeted the elderly gentleman seated beside her, the ancient husband of one of the other society ladies. Turning back to me, she whispered, a hammer. Then passing me a platter of dinner rolls, she added, 3 blows to the head. I coughed so hard that one of the servants had to escort me from the room to sit in the foyer with a glass of mint tea until I got a hold of myself. Why do you think she coughed so hard? Interesting. That is the end of chapter 22.